Welcome to Learning cEDH, the podcast dedicated to teaching you everything you need to know about competitive Commander. I'm your host, Matthew, and I'm joined once again by my co-host, Eric. And today we're doing the fan favorite topic that we do, and that is the quarterly update. We're looking at July through September and going over the best performing decks at events that had 64 or more entries, and talking about what decks did the best, what decks, mainly what decks did the best. We'll talk about a couple that, a few that have kind of fallen down a little bit, but for the most part, we're just going to be covering those top 10 decks that have got the most entries into top 16, and then we're going to be covering their conversion rate. We'll look a little bit at their top 4 conversion rate and decks that have won, but yeah, this is always like the fun thing that we look forward to. This is one of my favorites to look at because we get to like actually say no, was there a Mardu Summer? Yeah, a little bit, and really dispel some myths and just dive into like what is actually happening in cEDH, not just what we feel like is happening.
Yeah, so all this is very possible by a particular software, I believe it's called Command Tower, that lets us look at all these sweet decks, and they even have the metagame breakdown on these. So you can actually like go to a tournament, pull it up, and it's like the top left, you can see metagame breakdowns. You can click on that and it lets you know like how many like versions of a particular commander was played. So big shout out to that software. I'm a fan. I mean, I think everybody should use it because it's just so convenient, but
some are opting not to. Some very large events that are being ran surprisingly without this very smooth and useful software that you can get over at Eminence's website. But for the most part, reasonable people are using it. And so if you want to follow along, because sometimes we get a lot of comments of like, where do I look at this info? And you'll find a link in the description. But we're going to be on edhtop16.com, and there's a lot of filters that you can use to look at decks. So you might just want to browse around on here a little bit, pause this, and then just see if you haven't been on the site. It's an awesome site. And we're going to go to tournament date. And if you're watching this, if you set it to the 1st of July, events after that of tournament size 64, you'll end up with exactly what we're looking at. If you look at this a little bit later when some decks are updated, it might look a little bit different for you. But yeah, that's what we're going to be looking at, and we're going to be going through down to number 10 all the way up to number 1 and talking about the decks that have done the best. And we're not really here to give you our opinion on these decks and whether they should be here, but really more we're going to try to make sense of these numbers. These are the facts of what decks are performing well, whether we like it or dislike it or have any other opinion on the list. And we're going to try to explain why that is. If you've watched the other episodes of this, you know exactly what we're going to be doing here.
Yeah, so super seamless like process. It's something that we've been doing for a little bit. So if you're new to the channel or you don't understand like, well, why are they doing a quarterly review? So the one thing I've noticed is like people get really caught up in like whatever's hot in a month. And that's not to say that those decks aren't doing very well or that they're not good, but seeing a quarterly view, you allow to see some like rolling data come in and actually see like what the trends look like and where decks are going. Was that deck just performing really great in July? Did it continue on? Did it taper off? Was it a precipitous drop down? So just having like a quarterly view, plus it coincides with more set releases. So again, it allows us to kind of like catch a deck or a series of decks to see that fallout from those sets. Like when we did our last one, we kind of ended it in June, which we just got the sprinkling of Bowmaster and the One Ring. So, from that set, and also too, just looking at cards like Born Upon a Wind and how that affected that. So now when we go back, we see that those cards have had a pretty big impact, or at least they're filling up slots in decks and like upgrading decks. So we're seeing it now over the last 3 months since July. So now we have more data to pull from. So that's why we do it this way. If you don't like it, oh well. It just makes it really simple and gives us a larger sample size. But we'll also kind of just mention when we get to the end, hopefully we'll just kind of like, hey, this is what happened in September. It shouldn't take that long. There is one big surprise in there. So
and the way that the data kind of shakes out will depend on what happened sort of outside of just cEDH, where if a big new set comes out, like when Modern Horizons 3 inevitably drops, that's going to have an impact on that quarter, and it's going to shake up things as it goes. For the most part, this is really a continuation or like a finalizing or just like a refinement of the same meta we basically covered on the last quarterly update. There haven't really been new commanders injected, and like the same cards are still legal. Other than like, I guess we got Doctor Who, but I don't think I think that card just got legal in the filming of this. So, but for the most part, this is going to just be what has happened and where have cards like Orcish Bowmaster, Lotho, things like that, the One Ring, sort of shaked out and where they ended up in those months post like cookout-ish meta, leading up into the next big event, which will be Top Deck Expo, brought to you by our amazing sponsor, Eminence Gaming. The Command Tower software by Eminence Gaming is perfect for hosting your own TCG events, with features such as easy to create event registration for 4-player and 1v1 Swiss-based games. Event management has never been so simple, and it's web-based, so no downloads required. Sign up for just $5 at eminence.events/subscribe. But with all that being said, we can just hop right into it. So the numbers we're going to be looking at here are the raw number of top 16s that a deck has. That's what these are sorted by. And that is sort of compared to the number of total entries, and that's weighed to give you a conversion rate. So for instance, the first deck we're going to be looking at is Yuriko the Tiger Shadow at number 10, which had 7 top 16s out of 29 entries, leading to a 24.14% conversion rate.
Pretty good resurgence for this deck, right? Like, would you say this is like the blue-black version of Kinnan?
No, it's not as good. It is, so it's definitely been, this has been one I've noticed because I have like a Yuriko player in my friend group who likes to just like kind of experiment with the list and is always looking at new decks. And I just noticed that like around Cookout, I was like, oh, there's actually like a Yuriko top 16. And then like it's just been happening more and more. Like every time I see it, I'm just like, oh, hey, look at this, another Yuriko list, and I'll send it to him. So this is one I definitely noticed was trending up. And I don't know why. There's a lot. I would say that this is a very grindy set of 10 decks that we're looking at for the most part. Especially if you look at like top 16s and top 4s, what tends to do well, especially at larger events. And I think Yuriko does really well in those environments when it can kind of get going. The problem that Yuriko often faces is that the first 2 turns, you're pretty much you're a control-y deck that's tapped out because you're so reliant on setting up that early Yuriko attacker, going to the next turn, tapping out to ninjutsu out Yuriko in a environment where it's like super hostile to that, where like turbo decks are running rampant. It's a little tough. But if you get to the point like the mid to late game, the one thing that Yuriko does have in common with Kinnan is it reaches a critical mass of just like, if we don't fully wipe the board, we're going to all die. And we're not going to be able to stop it with stack interaction or any other sort of thing other than just win on top of it. Which is hard because they're going to be drawing lots and lots of cards and dealing lots of damage and making your ad nauseum useless. So I think it's really just kind of showing how if the games play out a certain way, that if a commander like Yuriko hasn't really gotten new cards since Kamigawa other than like Bowmasters. And so it's really, I think, just showing that the meta currently probably favors Yuriko, and maybe some of the play patterns that other people are having are just lining up with Yuriko.
Yeah. So also, like, I know Yuriko typically has like a lot of fluff in the deck, you know, because of just the way the deck's designed. But ultimately, it's a bunch of free counter spells.
Yeah.
It's got a Thassa's Oracle combo into it. It happens to run really good cards like Bowmasters, Oppo, Doughty Voidwalker. I could probably see Talon potentially in this list. I haven't looked into Yuriko like that deep, but that card's pretty powerful in itself, the way it's been like lining up in these like mid-range decks. But I just think Yuriko just really takes advantage, and it's like one of the few true tempo decks in the format. So
yeah, there's not really anything super crazy going on. When you called it it's almost more the Dimir Niv Mizzet than it is than Dimir Kinnan, but it's a little bit of both. But it is just jamming so much free interaction, and it gets paid off for it. Unlike, which Niv kind of does once Niv is developed, but it's so much easier to develop Yuriko. Like, you just get paid off for, you flip a commandeer off of Yuriko, you know, that is a big payoff. And also you let everybody know, like, hey, if you go for a win, I'm going to have something to do with that.
Yeah. So the only reason I said is just the Dimir Kennan. It's just because it's a barrier to entry deck. Like it's one of those like really good beginner friendly decks of like Kennan itself that just also happens to translate decently in the competitive realm. So that was my really only
Oh,
true
yeah.
comparison, but
It definitely does. And I think it having kind of like what I talked about, that it has that easy play pattern of just like turn one, I know I do this, turn two, I know I do this. And then it kind of branches off. That's where like a lot of the skill starts to come into it. Cause I do think it's probably not the easiest deck to take into like an event to top 16. It's probably not that, like just doing the Yuriko thing, sometimes that'll work. But you're really gonna have to pick your spots because, like I said, like when you're tapping out that much, because it is sort of tempo-y, you have to know when to use that free interaction. And it looks like maybe some pilots have decided to like really focus up and have been able to turn that into more results.
yeah. Good job for the Yuriko pilots. That's pretty cool.
But at number 9, we have the only deck that matters because it fits the narrative of Mardu Summer. That is Dihada Binder of Wills, with also 7 top 16s, 28 entries for a slightly higher conversion rate of an even 25%.
Sweet deck, had a lot of innovation on it. Dihada's a really interesting ad nauseum deck because it's like chunky Nas. You know, that's when you look at it, like it's the one that really tries to go, I don't care about my my CMC or CMV, whatever it's called, and I care about the card quality over everything because Dihada produces a tremendous amount of mana, and it's like it's able to really abuse cards like Magda or Magda, whatever you want to however you say it, to go get like a Bolus Citadel, those type of things. But it can just cast these cards like relatively easy, and so when you can like play like Dihada on turn 2, and one of your payoffs simply is something like a Beseech the Mirror or the One Ring, and that's like opposed to ad nauseum and like Bolus Citadel. So it just has like these like really high payouts, and getting obviously access to the white silence effects and removal. That's something I think people need to consider when they're talking about white, because everybody always says, "Oh, white gets silence," and that's great. It's true. It gets all the good silence effects. It gets Esper Sentinel, but like the removal in white is by far better than anything else. Like you can't argue with how good like Swords and Path is like versus the field. Like when you look at like red decks or even black decks, you're kind of like having to pick and choose. Like, oh, do I run Fatal Push or do I run Dismember or do I run Lightning Bolt or do I do I run Rending Volley? Like there's no like automatic, hey, these are the de facto 2 best cards that answer any size creature threat in the format, and it exiles it. So that's something I just want to say, like playing white gives you that access to not only like great creatures, good silence effects, as well as having like really good removal on top of it, and some good toolboxy cards like Oswald Fiddlebender or Portable Hole. Again, great removal. Like that card is fantastic. Or Out of Time, so that's one of those things that I've noticed that like some of the decks we're gonna see, like one of the decks we see like later on that's like creature based, like Out of Time's really good against that. So I don't know. What do you think about Dihada? It clearly did pretty well.
I want to touch on the removal thing too, because white removal is one of those things that is sort of been like literally alpha did it like one of the best cards ever for in terms of it, but it's still gotten cards that are relevant recently. Like Touch the Spirit Realms is a huge one. Being able to get rid of something for the turn without even having to cast a spell if you channel it. March of Otherworldly Light, also like a playable one, and we saw some people on card that exiles and you can recast it for 2 more mana.
Soul Partition.
Soul Partition. So like it's been getting, and that's like red is not getting a lightning bolt level thing. Black hasn't really gotten a top tier removal option other than like Cut Down, which is still sort of like more situational than a lot of these white cards.
Yeah, worse than Fatal Push, probably.
Yeah. If you're slanting more proactive, you kind of need the ability to, when you're deciding to go off, you need to be able to get rid of those things that are stopping you. You don't have like a Psych Rift to do on the end step in Mardu. So having those instant speed, like, oh, here's a way that I can deal with it, especially if you can back that up with like silence effects, again, very good. But yeah, Dihada is just like, it does so much for mainly one, it's a Planeswalker with 3 abilities. Mainly it has 1 ability, and that ability does so much. It fuels your breach, it generates mana, It allows you to generate card advantage if that's relevant. Like, it has the option. The deck runs so many incidental legendary cards that you can choose to put into your hand. It gives you a really good breach outlet with Flicker was one thing we saw. Like Lauren or MTG Hot Dog, I believe, was the one who came up with that, or at least had one of the first results of this quarter with it. As just like another way to win with Breach. You just keep flickering Dihada, you keep milling, you make treasures along the way. It basically is like another Lion's Eye Diamond that doesn't require you to discard your hand. So it is really just a commander that offers a lot. The pip intensity of the commander is sort of relevant when you first play it and you're like, wow, 3-color deck that can't use Jewel Lotus, lol. But or not as effectively at least. Yeah, it's a strong deck. It has a lot going for it as a proactive list, but again, it also has like you're talking, if you're just sitting around and getting to uptick and then downtick Dihada back and forth, you're really setting yourself up for like a long game to be able to go off. And again, if you just do a lot of this, people are developing stacks and then you just slam down and out of time and then just go off and you have this massive graveyard that you build up, you have like a lot going on for you if you're like a shrewd enough pilot to kind of know how to navigate those scenarios.
Yeah, and I just think a lot of the like Tymna Jessica players, they really gravitated more towards Dihada because it offers a lot of the same elements that all those decks have. Granted, you don't have the Tymna attackers, but what you lack in that, you make up for with the combo potential of Dihada and just the overall speed of the deck. And it still runs like relatively like 75 to 80 of the same cards, give or take, like some like, are you on the Saris and like Tymna Jessica, or you're, because you're not probably playing it, you're probably on like Dragon's Rage Chandler or something like that, But yeah, Dihada, pretty good Turbo Nas deck. And again, it has the ability to just plant one of these like sticky pieces, kind of like a Necropotence or the One Ring, those type of cards, and just like start trying to like grind like cards. But of course, it ultimately just has that ultra explosive ability to just do the turbo thing. So, pretty solid deck. I'm very shocked to see that, not that the deck's doing well, but that it has like Mardu Summers, like this is part of Mardu Summer, but we're gonna see like, does this deck continue?
Yeah.
Like that's gonna be the really interesting. That's why we love doing these updates, is because does the deck continue? We know we have like some pretty competent pilots on. I know Zane was on Dihada, but Zane opted to go back to Roxai. And MTG Hot Dog's obviously been championing Dihada, quite a bit. So yeah, pretty wild to see. Hopefully it continues doing well.
People might have been expecting Tymna Jessica to be in this spot instead of Dihada. I think like I think this is Dihada's first appearance, and Tymna Jessica was on the last one, or it was tied around this position. And I do think Dihada offers like a more focused game plan that doesn't require as much building around it. You run a few cards that help you, do more with Dihada, but you aren't like massively shifting your like the card types that you even care about. Like if you're not running Tymna, you don't have to run creatures you don't want to run. You're just not pushed in that direction to do more like a general game plan, which makes the deck a little bit maybe less toolboxy than like the Chernobyl decks that are built to just win in any scenario. But it is like a very focused deck. Speaking of focused decks, this isn't really that. Next, we are talking about Kenrith the Return King, another deck tied with 7 top 16s, 27 entries, leading to a 25.93% conversion rate. It is good stuff. We've talked about, if you watched the last episode, that Kenrith isn't that good stuffy. It has like a really nice support package of all of the good cards that you could want. But there are, again, we see like people go different directions with Kenrith, but that's what a 5-color, that's like what a sort of generically good commander lets you do. With all 5 colors, you can just put the things that you want in. And it's a deck that's just like, it keeps popping up around this spot. It's just keeps doing really well. There's a lot of pilots that are messing around with it. You have slightly more proactive slants. You have very reactive slants. You have very creature combo-y focused ones. There's really not that much to talk about with Kenrith. It is very much just, hey, I have a big dude in the zone that I can dump infinite mana into and win. And it lets you do it any way you want. You get to reanimate stuff. You can do Mayhem Devil. You can do Deadeye Navigator, whatever you want. Emil Dockside. any manner of different ways that you want to combo and usually make infinite mana. Plus you get Breach, Ad Nauseam, Intuition, all that good stuff.
One thing is obviously the flexibility of it. It's a good Jewel Lotus. It's a great Jewel Lotus deck because it just makes it so easy to cast it, and it's only like 1 white mana, and it's a mana cost. But Kenrith is basically what, to me, is what replaced the First Sliver. You mean like the First Sliver Food Chain deck, the Underworld Food Chain deck with First Sliver, which was like this 5-color good stuff. It was all about like this turbo plan that happened to have Food Chain in it as well, because that was like kind of like the backup part of it. That's what ultimately like graduated to. And that deck was really sweet. And I think Kenrith is just really the next evolution of that deck, effectively, with obviously not needing Food Chain. So that's where I think that deck falls, because now its combos are a little bit more cleaner. You don't have to run, like, you just get to run like a meal and Oxide. So it's a little bit easier that way. And the one thing I like about Kenrith is Kenrith doesn't have to commit Kenrith to the board until it's needed. You know, like, you're still just turbo ad nauseum plan if that's what you're wanting to do with it. And then at any point, if the game gets gummed up, Kenrith is like this insane ultimate like breaker of the game.
Yeah.
So
that's what I was gonna say. Is like what really sets it apart from First Sliver is with First Sliver you basically don't have a commander. You don't want to cast the First Sliver if you're not about to win, because just like 5 mana Cascade, that's not a game plan. That's just a creature on the board. Kenrith is a thing that you can develop that is technically a combo piece, but isn't a must answer combo piece. It's not like you put a Devoted Druid into play or something. But it can be a relevant thing on the board. You can affect combat with it. You can draw cards with it. It can be a Thrasios. It can be a reanimation outlet. There's a lot of things that it offers, and it's way more castable than First Sliver. And it's just a lot more relevant. And again, Eric and I have kind of talked about how Food Chain is positioned very strangely right now, where you're having to cast a bunch of spells, generate infinite mana, but you can't pay for Ristics or anything like that. Like, you have an infinite combo that doesn't really work in the way that a lot of longer games kind of tend to go. Kenrith doesn't even have to cast spells. Kenrith can win an instant speed. If somebody removes the combo, the stacks piece that's stopping Kenrith from playing, it can win right on top of everybody without even casting a single spell.
Super impressive deck. Glad to see it. Like, because we talked about this deck, like, whether it was the last episode or the episode before, like I think people were sleeping on it a little bit.
Yeah.
It's like, man, that deck's like really sneaking up on people. So, and I know there's been some really good pilots playing Kenrith. So good to see that Kenrith is, you know, still in the mix. So.
It's really one of those where, like, you could call it the Kenrith effect, where when people look at like top 16s, their eyes just roll over all the boring decks that they've thought of as boring. And so like rolling over Kenrith and like, oh, Slicer, rolling over all these other good decks and are just like looking at those. But like Kenrith is just the name that's always there. So notably, the last 3 decks all had 7 top 16s. There's a huge jump, which we did not see in any of the previous updates, going from 10, 9, and 8 up to the next decks. Like number 7 with 12 top 16s is a big jump. And there's more big jumps that we're going to see here. Like this is a sort of lopsided top 10, whereas a lot of the last ones are really gradual. And I don't really know why that is, other than maybe like the good decks are getting better and more refined. I don't really know what that means, but I mean, let's just talk about the deck and we'll see what we notice. This next deck, the way that Eminence displays these is a little weird, because based on the stats, I think this really should be number 6, because it's tied for top 16s, but it has a higher conversion rate. We're going to talk about them the way that they're listed for, the ease of like viewers just following the list and it matching up. But maybe this should be number 6. Take it with a grain of salt. They're so close statistically, you could view these as a tie anyways. Doesn't really matter. But that is Rog Sai Till You Die right there. Rogue Silas with 12 top 16s, 51 entries, leading to a 23.53% conversion rate.
Thought the deck was trash.
It's so weird that these bad decks keep ending up at the top of these lists. It's so strange. I don't understand it. So yeah, notably at the beginning of this quarter, so this is with a sort of almost like outlier event, maybe you could call it that. Everyone was down on Rog's side because the very first event that I think is in this quarter, or the first really big one, was the Cookout, where no Rog side's top 16. And everybody was saying that Rog side was terrible and it's a paper tiger again, blah, blah, blah. And then immediately Zane goes and wins the very next event. He tops another event that he had the win, but misplayed or punted, however you want to put it. Didn't see the line. And so the deck is still good. The deck is still great. Don't look at a single event. Don't even look at a single quarter necessarily and write off the deck. But especially single event, that is ludicrous. The deck is very good. This is one of the more consistent decks in the format. It's one of only, I guess now we actually have 3 decks I would classify as turbo in the top 16, whereas previously, like, this has been like often the only turbo deck, or along with Najeela, one of the only turbo decks. And it does what it does really well. It's built to take advantage of the super consistency that Rograk offers. It's the best deck at countering spells in the early game. It's the best deck at powering out more mana than everybody else in the early game. You want to do a turn 1 Rhystic, you want to do a turn 1 Naz, whatever you want to do, mainly tending towards the early game, it's the best deck at doing it because Rograk just offers so much in raw advantage in terms of mana and consistency.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of this deck, and it's like no surprise. But it's also because, just understanding the nuance of the deck, and like fundamentally, it's pretty cracked, and for what Roger offers the game. And I get like some people, that's just not their flavor. They liked having their card advantage in the command zone, but you're in blue, you have access to Rhystic Mystic. Also, you have access to the One Ring, which that was a great adoption of the deck because the deck is an excellent One Ring deck in terms of being able to just generate tons of mana early in the game, so you can just slam down a turn 1 One Ring. The games when you have like a draw engine in Rogsai, it almost feels unfair trying to fight through them.
Yeah,
like, and it makes it really, because like the Tymna Kraum decks, they don't have it, whatever gets killed, something like that, but they have Tymna Kraum to fall back on. Rogsai doesn't, but then when Rogsai gets card advantage plus the mana reduction, it's pretty wild. Like that now you're really looking into like a pretty fundamentally broken deck in terms of like how it operates. So that's the thing about Rogsai. And then obviously good pilots on Rogsai really helps the deck out quite a bit, because Rogsai is one of those things where I think like you really do need I don't want to sit there and say like a good player, or a higher skilled player to understand the fundamentals of the deck. Also, just Storm is, most people think you just go Burr and that's it. But in reality, Storm has, I think, a lot less window opportunity because, it doesn't have like the Tymna Kraum effect of like being able to just kind of catch you back in the game, especially decks like this. So you really have to pick your spots and understand. And the biggest thing is, it is effectively what added 3 cards from just Lord of the Rings. It had Orcish Bowmaster, which was a great upgrade for that deck because the deck was on like an Oppo agent plan, but then realized like, no, we just want like a tutor in that slot, And so the Bowmaster still allows you to be like proactive against stacks creatures, but then it has a tremendous amount of wheels in the deck. So it not only can like clear the way of other creatures that are like causing issues, particularly like Staxy creatures, Manglehorns, those type of things, or whatever, like the wild Kinnan players playing. But, being able to just like Bowmaster Wheel is a pretty powerful board wipe, which that's what the deck kind of struggled with because it was like, is it on Cyclonic Rift if it's off Cyclonic Rift? It kind of has Cyclonic Rift built at home, built in that particular position. It got the One Ring. It got Born Upon a Wind, which I think is actually secretly the hugest upgrade for the deck, because I think that card is ultimately insane in these type of like ad nauseum necro style decks. So that's been pretty big. And then I believe, at least in my list, but I've seen in like Zane's and like Bryant's list of Grim Tutor just became Beseech the Mirror, which is like a pretty easy swap.
And it got Mount Doom as well.
Yeah, oh yeah. And Mount Doom. So sorry, forgot about Mount Doom, which shouldn't be forgotten because again, it's just a dual land 90% of the time. But again, late game, if you are getting like stacked out, you just have this kind of like button that you can hit and like clear the board. So yeah, Rockside, good deck.
Yeah, relevant. I guess some of those also relevant to Dihada. We kind of looked over with them getting Lotho, also a good Mount Doom deck. I got to activate Mount Doom in Dihada one time and just totally blew everybody out, and it was amazing. And it helps because that deck makes you just, if you're not winning, you just make a bunch of treasures and leave them lying around, and the activation isn't that hard. Bowmaster being able to often kill a player is also really relevant if you're doing it on an instep or in response to a thing. Just being able to take out a couple blockers, make a 22-22, and then smack into somebody, smack into the control player, the guy who has the stacks pieces, whatever. That isn't often how you're going to win a game. You're not going to win with a token, but it's going to, shut down one axis of who's able to interact with you. And then it's hard enough when 3 players are trying to stop the Roxai, which often will end up happening. That's the trouble with the deck, and the struggle you might find is like a new Roxai pilot is you are when there's nothing in play, you're the immediate enemy. Everyone just assumes that you're threat number 1 because your deck is really fast and good and is absolutely, in my mind, favored in the early turns of a game. So that is a bit of thing you get over. But like Eric said, if you get that little bit of card advantage, your cards are worth so much more than everybody else's, that you get like the highest density of mana production. You're only running things that win you the game. You're not often digging for like a force of negation to stop another win attempt. Sometimes you are, but like, and then again, once you get that mana production, at least you have a little bit of extra mana lying around and you're drawing lots of cards. It makes it a little bit easier to have 2 pieces of interaction instead of just the one. Being able to go Force of Will and a Flusterstorm or something, that makes it so much harder to get through all the win attempts that you're going to get to make, because again, this is a deck that can just push, keep putting on win attempts. If all your stuff gets stopped, you have a bunch of tutors in the graveyard. Oh, I found an Underworld Breach. Easy game, easy life. And one of the only decks that takes advantage of a card that should maybe be played more in Jessica's Will. Absolutely broken when you have a 0 mana commander that if you can Jessica's Will into either a Breach or a Wheel often, that's just a win.
And the things that also like Roxai, and I promise, well, we're not going to talk forever about Roxai, but the one thing that there's 2 elements I really like about this deck particularly. One was the Bowmaster, but the fact that the Bowmaster token, the Orc army, actually just gives the deck so much extra fodder for its Culling Rituals, its Diabolic Intent, its Phyrexian Tower, which that takes a lot of pressure off your Roger. So your Roger was the one that was obviously mostly getting sacrificed to those things. So sometimes it would cut your Fierce Guardianships off or your Deflecting Swats off. But now you don't have that issue inherently. Like you have another outlet for those. You have another resource piece. And so I think that shouldn't be understated. And then the other one, it's like I'm double checking this top 6, top 10 list. It's easily the best Bergie deck out there, right? Like,
oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and Bergie's cracked. Like, like Bergie is a card that we've discussed on like at least, and actually I want to give like credit to Drake Sasser on this. I think Drake on a podcast with Playing with Power was talking about I don't think we've seen the true upper echelon of like how good Bergie is. And it's just like this card that's like great Storm Engine on the front side, a great Storm Engine on the back side.
Yeah.
And we all know everybody loves Bergie's backside. It's the best.
I did see Zane recently just tweeted that Harnfell is his favorite card right now. And it feels so good when there's so rarely a spot where one part of Bergie isn't good. And then you're also in a deck like we talked about that has so much mana production. 4 and a red, can be a struggle in certain scenarios where mana is really tight. But in like a post-Naws scenario, the deck is just able to make so much mana that if you don't already get there, just slamming either the Bergie to help make a bunch of mana or the Harnfell to just essentially draw the rest of your deck. Very hard to lose in that spot. And it's also like a threatening piece that you can actually just develop that people aren't that likely to interact with. You can if you're just sort of sitting behind your, draw engine or you're just not ready to go yet. It is actually a card you can just develop to the board. Kind of like a Wishclaw Talisman, which might be a little bit more likely to eat a counter. Just like a thing you can put into play that is going to just set you up for next turn where you just get to untap, have a Bergie, basically have doubled your mana probably. And it's just super good card.
And if you never cast Beseech the Mirror into a Mnemonic Betrayal or a Yawgmoth's Will, like if the Breach is, like let's say Breach isn't the option for whatever reason, if they have Besage you or something like that. But being able to beseech into a Mnemonic Betrayal is pretty wild. Like, that it's got a lot of upgrades to the list that was already really kind of revolutionized. But now it's got these just just way better upgrades, and like it fixes some of the issues or the like weaker points of the deck. Like, I mean, it's a pretty impressive deck. It is like one of the decks that, like, like, I know we joke about like me playing Corval, but like, I play other decks, but it's like one of those decks that sometimes I kind of go, "Ooh, it's really hard to go back to Jun." It's like it's so much better, but I Rockside is a good deck, and again, I think it has a little bit lower floor for less experienced pilots, but its ceiling is clearly a trophy. So take that information as you will.
And what's wild is we didn't even mention these aren't new cards, but in this sort of time frame, we saw the adoption of both Grinding Station and Conqueror's Flail as sort of like accepted staple-ish cards of the deck that we weren't really seeing even the last time we recorded. Like going into the cookout, those weren't cards you were seeing, but then right after that, the around like Surfside, that was like something Zane adopted, and then we've seen like most of the decks now are adopting one of, if not both of those cards.
Just Grinding Station, just obviously giving the deck like a little bit like denser win con, because I think there's a balance in like a lot of these decks where you can have like jam packed full of win cons to where it dilutes your deck. But ultimately, when you like put in like a Grinding Station also just happens to be like really good for your breach plan, and you're already playing a ton of artifacts anyways. So again, it's just one of those cards that smoothly like gets added to the deck, and you just feel like it's been there the whole time. It's really interesting.
Anyway, I think we did enough on Rogsai. Clearly, we like the deck, but also in our defense, that was a lot of cards that have come into the expected like tool like list of staples of the deck. Like we're talking about like eight or nine new cards that weren't getting played last time we updated that are now like that's like a huge change in 3 months for like the expected deck list of a very established cEDH deck that's been around that top 5, top 10 level the entire time we've been doing this series. And again, like we mentioned, and we're about to mention with our next deck, this deck is clearly like if we could, I would say with this version of the list, with the way that the top 16 sort of worked out, where there's these big gaps, this is like clearly in like the next tier of decks above the last things that we saw, at least for this quarter, with nearly double the amount of top 16s. And next up on our list, with 12 top 16s, 55 entries for 21.82% conversion rate. Again, slightly lower than Rogsai. Whatever, they're basically tied. That is Atraxa Grand Unifier, the only half decent food chain deck in the format.
Trying to think. Don't tell the Atali players that they'll come at you. The green red Atali players. They're gruel, so they can't read. So
oh god.
I'm joking. I can't read either. I play Jun.
This is a deck that kind of got the Tivit treatment at first, where people were kind of like iffy on it and kind of like, is it a meme? Blah blah blah. Too much mana. But that we were kind of had spotted, I think not in the last episode, but the one before that like this is a deck to watch out for. And then last episode we saw it was hovering, I think a little bit lower, I want to say, but somewhere around this mark of just like, no, this is like a deck you should look out for. We saw going into like Cookout, one person played it, so it was looking like Atraxa, at least in just July, wasn't doing as much. But like, no, we've seen like this is a deck especially that seems to pop up, made some waves at the SCG Con Columbus, and then also it seems to pop up a lot in the online events mainly. Again, this is sort of a 4-color good stuff-ish list. It's not running red, so it doesn't get to run the best stuff. But most of it, like it's a lot of staples. It tends to go grindier. It's not really trying to turbo out Atraxa, although it is a thing. You can absolutely play like turn 2 Atraxa if things line up for you. But it's really just looking to establish like mana dorks and value engines in the early game. It runs slightly slower engines, things like Smothering Tithe that a lot of decks aren't running. This is a deck that gets to take advantage of cards like Lotho and just sort of get advantage going throughout the game, and then get to a point where it can usually either just combo out with Teferi Displacer Kitten, or combo out with Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation, or setting that up with Atraxa and Food Chain.
Yeah, so this deck is pretty much like, to me, supplanted like Tymna Thrasios. And when you look at like the obvious, like, because if you were to like look at those decks, they'd be pretty similar overall. And, there's like so many variations of like Tymna Thrasios. I don't want to like get into the weeds of like whether on like Hermit Druid or like Razakats or whatever. By the way, I had a Razakats build of like Traxa. It was super sweet. Been able to like Eldritch Evolution or really Neoform like your Atraxa after you got all his value off of it into like a Razaketh was like pretty disgusting. So that was pretty fun. I actually really enjoy that deck. But when I look at Atraxa and what Atraxa can do versus those other decks, like those type of the Thrasios decks that are in the same color pie, is that you're spending 4 mana to do the card thing, like to like spin the wheel. Atraxa is just like, hey, reveal 10, probably draw 4 to 6 cards every time. And a 7/7 creature that's on the battlefield, that's going to take over the board. And plus it has like a salad bar of abilities. It's going to be able to do the life race really well because it's life link.
Yeah, it takes over combat.
Yeah, it's just it's such an impressive card. Obviously, it's really impressive in constructed formats, but to see that card come here and like it really does just turn the table quicker than those decks. So while we look at like some of the like clunkier cards in it, the deck is really devoted to mana. So it has tons of mana options into it. So it's not trying to like short itself on being able to like cast this. So it understands its role. Whoever the minds behind Atraxa, they understand the role of the commander. They want to make sure they can cast the commander. And ultimately, it is what? It has a Thassa's Oracle combo set up in it. It's really easy, elegant as a finisher. So it has all these like kind of like nice elements. So it can grind. It can just do the whole tutor silence thing, lock you out and win. It has the ability to take over combat. It has the just out of nowhere food chain combo with Atraxa. So yeah, overall, like really impressive deck for what it's doing. And I think people just gravitate towards Atraxa too. Like I think it's because it's a cool card. It looks cool. This is just my thoughts. But when people draw cards a lot, especially people who play blue, they feel way smarter than they really are. They do. Just people just feel smart, like they're just so clever and they're just
plans all coming together.
Yeah, that's literally what it is. And I think this kind of like having the green and the blue mixed together, so it's got like a really like nice Timmy effect to it.
And plus it's a follow-up to one of the most played and beloved commanders of all time that was like stuck, which I think is relevant in terms of like people playing it, choosing to play this commander, was that Atraxa had a commander that was stuck in high power or just like hated in lower power casual because it's too much, but has no relevance in cEDH whatsoever. And then it got this commander that, which it took a little bit of people figuring out what to do with it in cEDH, but it absolutely clearly is a cEDH commander.
Good deck. Pretty cool.
And I wanted to touch on the Tymna Thrasios comparison a little bit, because I was playing against this deck last night and we kept talking about it in comparison to Tymna Thrasios. And I think one thing that it does is Tymna and Thrasios offer you a really good floor in the early game of what your deck is capable of. Where a lot of times when you're mulliganing, you're thinking like, at least I have like a turn 2 Tymna. I have a turn 1 Thrasios, which is some sort of development, especially again if you're playing like Moxhammer or stuff like that. It can be relevant. Turns on your fierces, stuff like that. But what often will happen in the early games, if things are going well for those decks, they're not developing Tymna or Thrasios, because those decks really aren't the greatest thing that you can do with your resources, or even often to generate resources, especially now as we see a lot of decks are very creature heavy. The best thing you can do, you'd rather be playing maybe even something like a Lotho that gets you mana, getting you towards your commander. Something like Aristic Study obviously is like the goal of, and something in this deck again is Smothering Tithe. So like often you're developing some sort of thing to develop your resources, and Tymna and especially Thrasios aren't really the best at that. And what Atraxa really offers you is a way to convert doing those better things in the early game into a much higher ceiling in the late game, which is like where Tymna Thrasios wants to be. It wants to get to the late game, but it doesn't have that crazy payoff of boom, Atraxa C10 cards. Even start doing like manual food chain stuff of just like exile my 3 dorks, exile Atraxa, boom, play Atraxa again. And it has that like built-in payout of like you did the things you want to do in the early game, you cast good cards, developed your dorks, got some mana, got some treasures, blah blah blah, and then boom, here's 10 cards. Here's your build your own ad nauseum. That may be why we're seeing it be better. Kind of like what we talked about with Dihada versus Tymna Jessica. Atraxa focuses you in more on a game plan, whereas like we've talked about before, Tymna Thrasios is just all over the place.
Yeah, unless you're playing like those like specifically designed builds where they're like all in like on a reanimator package or like hermit druid and stuff. And then again, I still think I keep saying like I really want to see like some more innovation because they have some really they have access to all the same colors and stuff. But I just think the payout on Atraxa is like way higher, and you're not paying 4 mana to like scry one draw card.
And I think the focus is even in like not even in the deck building. I mean just in the commander. Atraxa asks you the question of how do you want to best take advantage of this super broken effect that I have? And Tymna Thrasios just asks you like, what do you want to do with the cards that you draw of sporadically throughout the game? How do you want to best do this? And people have often talked about like dorks don't work that well with Tymna, and like they work better with Thrasios, like which game plan you want to go in. But I think like when you have however many pilots look at Atraxa, they're just like they have one question to answer and they just go, well, how do we do Atraxa the best? Instead of like, what's my brand of Atraxa of like, Razakets, Hermit Druid, all this stuff. They're just like, well, let's do Atraxa the best that we can. And let's focus in on what it does. All right. Next up, still in, I guess, if we're going to break them up into tiers, still in the same tier, but with 13 top 16s and 60 entries, leading to a 21.67% conversion rate. We have Sisay, Weatherlight Captain, the cool 5-color deck that we keep talking about every time. And I think is just even more cementing itself. Like last time we talked about, it was like almost a little sort of surprising to see it in the last one. I think that was its first appearance. And then in this one, I would have been surprised if Sisay wasn't here in this top 10 for this quarter, because the deck keeps doing really well. It just gets better. And this is a deck that we've talked about, like it's kind of hard to play if you like it has a very unique thing that it does. And so like as pilots keep playing it, the deck I think just keeps getting better, and it keeps getting new legends like we talked about. They love printing 50,000 new legends into every set, and one of them ends up in Sisay every time.
Yeah, eventually Sisay is gonna have to start like looking at cards to cut, because they just can't keep getting away with this. They just keep getting.
Eventually, they're gonna print like legendary Birds of Paradise, and it's like, oh, we get that, and then it's just like the whole creature suite will be legendary, and they're just gonna have to find some cuts. But as it is, it seems like they're just gonna keep getting to swap in new things.
I haven't pulled up a Sisay deck recently, as of like this recording, but are they on Delighted Halfling? So while he's looking for Delighted Halfling, I know Atraxa is on Delighted Halfling. So my whole point was to not to piggyback off and bring up Atraxa again, but again, having like a main deck mana dork that allows you to push through your really expensive legend, because nothing would feel worse than getting it Force of Will, but I think that's just a really good upgrade for those kind of decks. So what are you finding?
So the deck that took down Festival of Nights, no Delighted Halfling. This top deck from Mox Master September was on it. Let's see, SCG Columbus with Ian, or he ran it. Waiting on this website. Oh, it's melee.gg. Got it. So SCG, please just be normal. You don't have to do this.
So if Ian's running it,
Ian did not run it. Ian chose not to run it.
Ian did not run it. So anything that Ian does run, you should just roll with it.
So it looks like there's a little bit of tension in it, and maybe it's because like it is a 5-color deck, and if your dork doesn't cast whatever, like your Delighted Halfling doesn't help you cast Valley of Devastation. Well, I guess it does. Whatever, it doesn't do a pip. Doesn't help you cast your Assassin's Trophy. Boom. Yeah. We had an option. Doesn't give you colored pips, so it didn't get that. But I'm assuming, and I see this in the deck list that I have pulled up, pretty much all the decks are on Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which is this is the first deck we've seen that has widely adopted this new card that was like a really big, unique, new thing that a lot of decks or a lot of players were really high on, and is doing a lot in other formats as well.
Yeah, so oddly enough, on the Agatha Soul Cauldron, Omnixilus, every Omnixilus deck I've looked at recently has been playing that card. So I think that's a little side tangent there, but
Nixilis?
yeah, Omnixilus has been because
What
he
does it
think
do?
about I think it's just more so because he already has the +1/+1 counter on him, so
That's true. He's got a million of those.
he's got a million of those. So you just
I mean, they get a
basically, as soon as
Dothy. I know that at least.
yeah, they get a Dothy, but I mean, just I think having it to, especially stealing things like Ranger Captain or something like that, is probably pretty good. I think the card's pretty interesting.
That is true.
Um,
It does get stuff from any grave. The card does a lot. It's incidental graveyard hate, which is always good in this format. A lot of people don't choose to run like Craft Digger's Cage, for instance, because like that card sets off your own stuff. Agatha just gets you value on it. It lets you do kind of whatever of these effects you want to do. If you need it to be graveyard hate, you got it. If you need to turn a bunch of your creatures into birds of paradise, you got it. If you need to just be able to, I know this made walking ballista lines more efficient than ever for decks like Heliod. Good card to watch out for.
to get back to sound like for us talking about Sisay, Sisay's just it gives a more unique approach than just Kenrith being the 5 colors. It's got a lot of nuance to it, and it's one of those where if you know the deck and you know your deck in and out, and you know like the meta really well, your ceiling for this deck is probably really high because of the ability to effectively tutor, whenever you really need to. And it just again happens to just be 5 color good stuff. It also just happens to, have some of the just easy, simple, best combos in the game. Um, I don't know. What do you think about Sisay as a whole? It's just really impressive to me. And again, great Jeweled Lotus Commander, right? Like,
Yep.
you just cast it.
Yeah, it's really notable. It's really hard to call it 5 color good stuff. I feel like you do get it's mainly the 5 color interaction package and tutors, but like they don't win with anything. They don't win with Thassa's Oracle. They don't win with Breach. They don't run ad nauseum. Like they aren't doing a lot of what we would when we look at a high color pile like Atraxa, Blue Farm, even Najeela. It doesn't do a lot of those things often. It is another one of those sort of like critical mass decks, but it's really sneaky. The cool thing about it, like when we get to Kinnan, we're going to talk about it. It can set up a spot where it can just hold up a lot of mana and then do the thing it needs to when it needs to. You get to just like decide, you know what, if I have to hold up mana to be able to whatever, silence an opponent, Flusterstorm, whatever, abrade even, replicate, blah, blah, blah. You can do that, or you can just like somebody does something, boom, cast this in response, or activate Sisay. Nobody knows what you're gonna get. That's one of the key thing. Like the difference between like this and 2 color Sisay. One, this gets all the good stuff, all the good colors. Also, it just puts it straight into play. People cannot interact unless they have an op agent. It's gonna happen.
So it gets good stuff and it has good colors. So is that not
It is
effectively
good stuff. I just want to note in terms of how the deck wins, and a lot like it runs 8 planeswalkers ish. Like there's tons of cards you would not see in terms of like if you compare this to like Najeela and Kenrith, like a lot of cards you're not going to see. It's run cool. There are good cards. You get to run cards like Tyvar. This is the only place you're going to see Oko nowadays. A lot of times. Some of the lists are on Dihada, Amanatu. You have a big combo you do with Nicol Bolas God Pharaoh or Dragon God, I think it is. So you get lots of cool little combo lines. The one very good Relic of Legends deck, I think. I keep seeing that card pop up in Kinnan. I'm not really sure exactly how good it is there, but here you got a ton of legends, and this is like the best rock you can have. This sometimes is going to be like better than a Dockside in this deck. But again, this is a deck that wins with Dockside. So you get to Dockside loop, you get to do Dockside. And also like Kenrith, a lot of times you can sandbag a win. You can be able to just like instant speed, somebody gets rid of the thing stopping you. We've seen this happen in tournaments. Boom, they didn't know your deck was able to go off then. Put a tutor on the stack, happens, put your thing into play, you get to win. We talk about how many decks are Secret Commander Kinnan, but this is Secret Commander Kinnan that its commander can just get Kinnan and put it straight into play. So like you actually get that Kinnan. You don't just have to dirtle around with your Thrasios for 4 turns and then until you find him. So yeah, awesome deck. Easily one of the coolest decks, I think, in the format. Not that that necessarily equates to why it's on this list at this high, but this is one of the more unique decks in the format, I feel. And if you want something that just is totally different than a lot of how a lot of other decks work, this is like a great, powerful place to start.
Definitely rewards good play and good understanding of your deck and your opponents.
Next in our top 4, so this is again where I would say like there's a substantial kind of jump. We go from 13 to 17 top 16s, 98 entries for a 17.3% conversion rate, the lowest we've seen so far. And that is with the 5-color Warrior Queen of Copium, Najeela the Blade Blossom. The lowest that we've seen her since we started this. She has been, I believe, 2 in the first 2 episodes. Then she dropped to 3 behind Tivit last episode and is now at number 4. And I think this is the only deck on here where I can very directly point to why a deck has fallen significantly. And that is because Memo didn't compete that much. Memo stopped competing for like 2 months, and now it's all falling apart for Najeela.
Yeah, I believe Memo's on the T and K sauce right now, so
we might not ever get him back then. That's the sad part.
Let's legitimately talk about like why it's.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's still in 4th place. It's still a obviously very powerful deck. I think there's quite a few factors that are involved with its decline. Memo, and I'm going to refer to the expert on this. Memo discussed like Orcish Bowmaster being one of them, and the other one potentially being like the One Ring, and just how the One Ring prevents like combat wins. But I would say Bowmaster is the larger of the two. The effects playing against like Najeela myself with a Bowmaster felt really good.
Yeah,
because I was just like, yeah, sweet Najeela, let's just pew pew it down. Effectively block with a token, pew pew, or in response to like a draw effect or whatever. But Najeela has kind of fallen victim, and just from like playing like me playing a lot of Storm, is falling victim to the new card Shiny Syndrome. And like every time like Wizards prints a new card, it's like, it's the One Ring, it's Opposition Agent, it's Orcish Bowmaster, it's Beseech the Mirror, like these big like, a few of those were 2 mana, but like really kind of splashy 4 mana, 3 mana effects. And literally the whole thing was speed needs no translation, right? So when the deck gets away from what it's really good at, and it goes down a different path, it completely changes the texture of what the deck does. And people say that like 4 or 5 cards doesn't make a difference in a deck. That's so emphatically incorrect. Like that, I hate to sound so absolute on that, but if you take a deck and let's say the deck's based on mana dorks, and I remove all those mana dorks from the deck, you don't think those mana dorks matter? You don't think they impact the speed of what that deck does? Playing all these kind of like, bigger cards or powerful cards and stuff. We've seen like the Nautilus Najeela deck win an event that was just on like the One Ring and obviously the other blue draw engines and stuff like that. But it still basically had all the elements of the speed of what Najeela does. Like Najeela's a very good Nas deck. It has multiple layers to win the game. I just think that maybe going back to the drawing board a little bit and just buckling down of what the deck's really efficient at and then going from there versus like, stretching the mana base or having to like force all these big thicker like I got to edit that out. Oh my gosh.
These thick creatures like Samut.
I think oh god, I've already fucked up my own thought process.
I have a couple thoughts. Now I will say that if Memo and a bunch of the other people who are testing Najeela very diligently and blah, 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 that if they ultimately find that these cards that they've swapped, they feel are worth it in their own testing and that maybe events just aren't shaking out that well for them, then I'll agree with them I'll say that they're correct on that if that's what they find. There is definitely a cost to including cards like triple black pip cards like Beseech the Mirror and Necropotence into your deck. And those, again, like when Eric's talking about cards, adding a couple cards, not changing, those are cards that they aren't something you can just kind of like ignore in your open. I mean, those are 3 and 4 mana, very prohibitive mana cost cards that sit in your hand that have a real timing restriction on them. You don't just cast Necro because you can. You don't just cast Beseech the Mirror because you can. Often, I guess you could, whatever. 4 mana Demonic Tutor, you can do that. There's definitely potential for things to be diluted. We've seen cards like somewhat recently come in that just like feel like must run. So like we've seen like Lotho gets pushed into the deck. There's definitely new things being jammed into the deck that absolutely change the deck, whether that's better or worse. We're seeing it trend worse, but the deck is different. And there's definitely enough cards that over the course of, we're looking at 98 entries, that's, I would say, large enough sample size for us to tell that something has changed negatively for the deck. Like Eric mentioned, Orcish Bowmaster is a brutal card for this deck. And where we're going to get to Kinnan, which I think is one of the highest performing decks that also gets hurt by it. But Sisay also gets hurt by it. And I think the difference between some of these other decks is Najeela has no political power whatsoever. Najeela is never the good guy. Ever. Najeela is the only turbo deck that also is a creature deck. And if you can throw down your Orcish Bowmaster and incidentally kill some of their dudes, you're going to do it because it's super valuable. The Najeela player doesn't care about you. They don't care about your family. They're just there to win. They're there to have Jewel Lotus in their opening hand every time, and they're going to cast it. And so any bit of political power that a Kinnan player might be able to say, like, oh, I need this Birds of Paradise because I'm holding up interaction to deal with the Najeela player, they're going to do it. So you can't do... It's the only good stuff deck that doesn't have that ability to, like, even Blue Farm, which has like explosive potential, has way more ability to politic in a game and say, like, look, I get that I'm sort of threatening, but we can all agree this deck is the problem right now. And I actually run interaction to deal with them. I haven't swapped over to Veil of Summer and a bunch of silence effects to just protect my own stuff. Like a lot of the Najeela decks I have run, they're more on those things. Like they might be running the new Legolas card, split second green instant. I don't know what it's called. Legolas's broken card. That is just like, hey, my Najeela cannot die this turn no matter what. There's literally not a card that can get in the way of this. And like that is a thing, especially as we've been talking about, where I think a lot of these we're maybe shifting a little grindier post cookout. At least in top 4 situation. There's still very heavily grindy decks focused. There's a lot of Kenrith, a lot of Kinnan. Sisay's there a lot. And I think that Najeela isn't grindy. The more you go, or as often now, without the very few number of like card advantage things it runs. I talked to Eric about this earlier, where Memo was finding that he really liked running some of the older Najeela like Pongo style cards. And I think that's part of it's related to this, that he liked the feeling of actually having one, a game plan that's not as focused as winning it early as possible because you lose political power. 2, an ability to have more going on in the late game where you have more cards that are relevant in the late game. And I think that we're just seeing like maybe none of these things are devastating factors for Najeela, but we just see like a lot of little things that are enough to bring it from 3rd to 4th. And I think with a conversion rate this low, which we didn't see with Najeela earlier, like I think this isn't just like another deck did better, because the deck above it also didn't do very well this quarter.
Again, I always like to, people who are playing the deck a lot more than me are in play testing against, like I play against, every time I play test, someone in my play group plays Najeela. And it's one of those things of where Christian and I are talking, and Christian's like always like struggling with like all these new additions because he doesn't feel comfortable with them. Like I personally don't like Lotho in the list. Like yeah. Lotho just kind of makes you fetch weird, right? Like earlier in the game, like it may not. What if like the way the Lotho lines up with the rest of your cards? Black and white's pretty prohibited earlier in that game.
Yeah, because the best things you can do early on in a 5-color deck are often either the blue value engines, the red commander that you're running, or the green dorks, or something along those lines. Lotho doesn't line up with any of those cards other than like an Esper Sentinel is the only other thing where like you could turn 1 white land, fetch for a white land, Esper Sentinel, turn 2 Lotho. But that's like actually something that kind of makes sense and something you might do and be reasonable. The rest of the early game cards, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, Najeela players, don't really line up with it as well as like a deck that's trying to cast Tymna on turn 2 or 3. That lines up incredibly well with trying to cast Lotho on turns 1 and 2.
Yeah, I just feel like that there's some pulling of resources, and then you would be like, well, the treasures that you make off Lotho, that's what you get to utilize. But there's still a cost to. It's not like you're going to hit your land drops every single turn. Like there's a cost of fetching those lands earlier on, and one of the restrictions of the deck is being 5 colors and having to fetch and knowing how to fetch, because it's not like Sisay where Sisay gets to tutor, for whatever they want. So I just think that, from a turbo's perspective, like a turbo player's perspective, getting back to what make the deck like really formidable, I think that's going to probably just give you the better results. And I don't know, like, is it Orcish Bowmaster that's keeping you out of like winning? Is that seriously like one card, like absolutely shutting you down? Like, I don't know. Like, if that's the case, then, wouldn't just simply running extra piece of removal or your own Bowmaster help with that? Maybe run Bowmaster over Lotho if that's the case, because mana is never the problem of the deck. It has access to Dockside, tutors, it's 5 colors. So, and I wonder too if moving away from what was the enchantment that it ran? It was the green 1 enchantment, Druid's Repository.
Yeah, Druid's Repository.
So I wonder if like removing from that card also was kind of like maybe the start of, kind of the identity of the deck changing. And when they went away from that card, that did take away kind of the attack plan a little bit. And then you're moving into a Chatterfang, but like you have a card that would basically combo with it. I don't know. I'm going to leave it up to the Najeela experts. It's still a top deck. It's still up there for the quarter, but it's definitely on the decline, and that is something just to look at. I wouldn't be shocked if Memo doesn't break it once again, figures it out, like the Cabal kids being really smart and stuff. So they'll figure it out. I think they'll tune Najeela back up.
I definitely think it's better to like over swing and just like try to do too much than it is to just be like, we're never going to change this deck ever. So I think like the fact that they are willing to adapt a lot of new cards, are willing to change what is, again, one of the most established decks in the format, is not a negative thing at all. And I wouldn't discourage them from continuing to do that. It's just that maybe this quarter, it didn't work out that well. And so I don't think any of them are going to say like, no, we're just going to keep choosing to win slightly less and stick with it, because they seem like they're very willing to experiment. And again, this is a deck that a year ago didn't even look like this at all. Like, this is a deck that's been transformed a lot, and I expect to see it continue to do well. I do think there's just something to note and comment on with like, okay, well, if the One Ring and Bowmaster are keeping our creature attack plan not as good, then are we, when they call the deck 5-color Roxai, but it's having that creature attack plan and that ability to win, having more ways to win than Roxai is kind of what makes that deck potentially better. And if those points aren't strengths of the deck anymore, then it's kind of worse than in Roxai in some regards. And maybe like, again, you get slightly more mid-range, or you change the way that you approach that, or you just run things to be able to deal with, again, those creatures. Like, if some of your cards just aren't lining up with, what's happening, then you got to experiment. And I'm sure that they will. Like you said, the Cabal knows all, seemingly.
That's a good one. They should use that. The Cabal knows all.
Next up, another deck that has been here quite often, fallen only ever so slightly, and that is Tivit Cellar Secrets, with 18 top 16s, 110 entries, leading to the lowest conversion rate on this list with 16.36%. This is something we kind of expected as this quarter evolved. We kind of kept seeing Tivit going from like top 4 and winning everything to like not that many of them in the top 16, and just seeing like what a lot of people thought was like an overly high adoption rate of pilots looking to grab the deck, expecting it to win, and not doing that well. I believe we talked about in the last episode how the deck was maybe getting too stacksy, and that I've talked to people who we talked with, that was with Zane, where he talked about how he thought that aggressively-ish pushing for an early Tivit and just slamming a win with your very easy 1-card win con was kind of the strength of the deck, and that as players have moved away from it, he expected that the deck wouldn't do as well. And again, this isn't a deck that has fallen off in any regard, but it is not doing quite as well. Whereas it looked like, My prediction the last episode was I wouldn't be surprised if this deck was number one next time. And it's still high up here, but it hasn't performed nearly as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's powerful. It's like the one thing about like these top 10 decks and even some of the decks that are slightly below, they're all capable of winning. I believe they've all won or have topped an event that has put them in a position to do really well. So I don't want to sit there and be like, yeah, Tivit sucks, don't play Tivit, because that's not it. That's not what we're saying at all. I just think it's just, it's really interesting that like before this quarter, like Tivit was like, 20, like one of the highest conversion rates. And, it was literally looking like it was going to like surpass Blue Farm in the terms of, number of people playing it and actually just maybe taking down events. And that's just not the case, actually. So it's still a really powerful deck. It's a good deck. It has a great core of cards. I don't know. I just think that as more decks evolve and shift, and we've had like a new surge of a deck over the last 3 months that really kind of pushed Tivit down a little bit. And I think just because the ease ability to cast this next upcoming commander, and we'll get into more of that later. But as Tivit, like I said, we talked to Zane, and I even like rehauled my Tivit list a little bit because like everything, you like, oh, like the answer to Turbo is to go more like Staxy, and add all to the cards. In reality, it's not always the correct choice. Sometimes it's to lean back into doing what you're already really good at. And this deck has got tons of artifacts, produces lots of mana, slams the commander that generates lots of value. You don't inherently need as many value pieces, even though they're already built into the deck. You've got all the good black, like staple creatures. You have access to the One Ring. You have access to, Mystic Remora, Mystic Study, all those type of things. So I think Tivit's still a great deck. I just think it just, again, and it may be a little bit cleaner deck list, just tune it up a bit. So I'll tell you whose list I really, really liked. Just played in a Chaos event. It was Ashani's. Ashani had a really sweet list. I think it was like 28 lands, but still ran like Cydia traders as well. Again, for that like burst of mana. I think that kind of approach is like a really good way to play Kinnan. Tivit. A spoiler alert, what do you think? Do you think where does Tivit go from here? Does Tivit still hover around that 3 to 4 mark? I think it's just because it's super popular and it's become like this safety commander for people to play, kind of like how Blue Farm was for a little while, where people just kind of like, it's easy. I can just jam a Tivit and, incidentally win the game. Like you don't have to be, no offense, you have to be an excellent pilot to play a turn 2 or turn 3 Tivit, and generate lots of card,
it's
card
like,
advantage.
It's like definitely become the most easy to recommend deck because like a lot of the complexities that like Blue Farm has are kind of gone here. You don't have to worry about like Nas turns. You're not trying to do like tight breach lines. Like a lot of the wins are just pretty straightforward. I think maybe one place that they could look at is like trying to evaluate, because you talked about like how do you beat faster decks, and that was sort of the thought of maybe why they run some of these effects like Graph Digger's Cage, all these other things. I think we talked about with Najeela, none of those cards really line up necessarily with Tivit's own game plan. They just don't hurt it. They hurt other people's. But and we've talked about how whether this is reality or not, that like it feels like if you want to do really well in a tournament, you need to be able to do well in those very sort of like typically grindy matches to be able to get into top 16, get to top 4, get to the win. Those typically are where we see like a lot of more grindy decks just tend to be up there. Like this was the case more so last year, I think, than this year, but still kind of the case. And those cards really aren't that great there. I don't feel like. I feel like if you want to win those matchups, getting a Tivit down, the best value engine anyone has in the command zone, getting that down kind of early is like the best way to just be better than those decks. Like if you slam down a Graph Digger's Cage turn 1, Blue Farm doesn't care about that. They're not going to breach win in a top 16-ish scenario until they know like coast is clear, all the stuff is got rid of. There's going to be a big fight over like an overloaded Psych Rift on like turn 8 or something. And then that's when people are going to be like pushing for wins. Like I don't think you have to necessarily push out all of these like asymmetrical-ish hate pieces to win against the fast decks, because you just kind of like just don't lose in the early turn. Like, you're already playing Esper, you just have like a lot of those tools in the main set. Not that you can't play some of these, but like again, every slot in your deck comes with a cost, and maybe that cost of the sort of slower game plan just isn't right. But then we did also see like, so we saw like at SCG Con, we saw like Callahan top forward with like a really grindy one with like Talion and Sheoldred, which again aren't cards that are there to necessarily beat down the aggro decks. They are the aggressive turbo decks. They're there to just like decimate people in terms of value and win. So I feel like that direction could be a good point. And I always think you should just run cards like Nas. I don't like. We've talked about this. The average converted mana value of Tivit cards is literally lower or around Rock Side, depending on your list. It's not that high of an investment to put that in. I really like it. Maybe that's not the direction that you go in, but I feel like being able to win and knowing where your weaknesses are and where your strengths are and building accordingly is kind of the way forward. Whatever you expect to need to be able to beat, don't just jam in cards because you sometimes lose to Roxai. I think if it's going to hurt your other matchups, which maybe is the case here, maybe it's not, but that's sort of my non-Tivit player take on some of the pieces. Because like the thing about a lot of those cards, even though they're good, is that nobody else runs them. You don't have like a lot of people rushing to run Grafdigger's Cage because like it doesn't do anything. It's like Null Rod. It does nothing.
Oh, the shot at the Collector Roof players. Hey, is that weird? Is there any Collector Roofs here in the top 10?
Absolutely not. Definitely not.
No, a really good point though is about the Talion and the Shieldred. While those are kind of the classic 4-drop grindy things, they also close the gap very fast. I mean, I don't know if you've played against Shieldred a lot, but now you're having a compound effect of Bowmaster, Shieldred, and Talion.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot. Those are chunks of life at a time. So while they're, for a slightly different reason, but like Bowmaster and Shieldred, I mean, that's you're bolting yourself every time you're drawing a card. Like that's pretty wild.
Turns out like a lot of these matchups, they're all about drawing cards. If you're doing that a lot, like making people use their life as a resource when they don't typically, or they're like their deck is built to not care about it, where they can just like, fetch away and spend their life on like a Fire Covenant or whatever, like all these different ways to use up your life that you don't care about. Tapping that Ancient 2 in every turn, putting burden counters on the One Ring. Those, especially if you have a flying 6/6, can really add up. And like we mentioned, like Tivit, I think was a big win was Bowmasters and cards like Lotho, even though it didn't tend to do that well here. But like jamming Bowmasters are like instep Bowmaster into like a Time Twister, which is a lot of the Tivit decks tend to be on because it doesn't fuel breaches and lets you just kill a player often with that Bowmaster. That's a pretty powerful play, and again, just like a way to do that with a Shieldred in play too. That's a lot of freaking damage.
And Talion is a pretty powerful like draw piece. It's a pretty powerful engine that again incidentally hits their life. So it's not because like singularly one card, it's that now there's a multitude of these cards. So again, it's a grindy piece, but also shortens the game. And if we're going to that evolution of 75-minute rounds, the name of the game is you got to win. Like you have to close the game out. Like shockingly, Magic players
can't just draw.
Is to win the game. So
something that maybe seem obvious that like you don't really get a tangible advantage when you play something like, let's say you play a Grafdigger's Cage or a similar effect that shuts down somebody else's value to do something. That doesn't equate to any sort of furthering of your game plan really, other than just like slowing people down. But like incidental life loss to your opponents is a thing that when you get it, even though it doesn't feel that valuable, it is something that changes the game that doesn't get undone when somebody psych riffs it or kills it. It's like a real thing that matters. Your life total matters, believe it or not, especially in this ad nauseum format. And it can be easy, like Eric was saying, like these don't seem that crazy, but like they add up. And Talion is a card that we don't really have a lot of data on for this quarter, but it might be one that we see in the next quarter end up in a lot of the 99. And we already did just see a top 4 very large event. So that it may even end up on this list. I don't expect it as a commander, but I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes kind of a staple of these like grindier Esper plus decks to run in their 99. Okay, and then one of the bigger winners of this quarterly update with 20 top 16s, 85 entries for a 23.53% conversion rate. We have Kinnan Bonder Prodigy, who has been kind of pushing its way up. It was kind of like low top 5 and then kind of like mid top 5. And then I think it was 4 last update, I want to say, behind Tivit and Najeela and our number 1. And now it's here at number 2. It's been in a real hot streak of just like top 4 after top 4, multiple wins happening. And it's interesting because a lot of the things we talked about as weaknesses, like with Orcish Bowmaster, of like, can any mana dork survive in this Bowmaster world? Kinnan says yes, it absolutely can.
I think we discussed Kinnan like even a while back before we interviewed Wounded, but it was like I kept saying like Kinnan's a cracked card. Like it's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like it's just so busted. And that's like index. That's not as the commander.
Easily the most played commander in the 99 of decks right now.
Yeah, so it's just one of those effects where it has a multitude ways to win. It translates dorks. And so again, we've discussed this. You know, people kind of poo-poo on dorks, you know, and green's bad and all this stuff. Well, I don't know. Kennan's in second. And what it does is it breaks dorks. You know, it breaks dorks, it breaks mana rocks. So it has 2 different plans. So again, if things align, if the creature plan isn't where you want to go, because let's say something like an Orcish Bowmaster is just going to gobble up your things, if you're able to get like a Kinnan out, and then your rocks immediately are disgusting. You know, they just produce an additional mana. They do some pretty wild stuff with that. So again, it has those 2 lines. It obviously has like all these kind of like big flip-ish like kind of creatures that it has. It doesn't necessarily have to go super deep into it. It runs cards like, you know, Perplexing Chimera. It obviously has like Nyxbloom Ancient. It obviously has like Void Winnower, those type of things. Hullbreaker Horror. So it has these cards that are pretty groundbreaking, like not groundbreaking, but like it just shatters the game when they enter. And obviously you can cheat them into play. It's a very good The One Ring deck.
I definitely think the best The One Ring deck. I feel like in terms of, we talked about this with Wounded, of just like you're at this point the only Seedborn deck to be found in the top 10. That is very broken enough. Players like Wounded have started running Manamo to be able to untap their One Ring and be able to do it extra. With Seedborn Muse, it goes very, very, very broken. I would say probably gained about as much as it lost. I guess maybe more in terms of like what Lord of the Rings did for it with both Bowmasters and the One Ring and blah, blah, blah. I think it is a deck that we've seen start to be built a little bit differently. Like a lot of the earlier Kinnan builds of even earlier this year were maybe more on the proactive slant. Like when we talked with Wounded, he talked about he thinks there's about 4 ways that you can build Kinnan. I think we're seeing more of the reactive kind of control-y, sandbagging your activations. Kinnan decks tend to do a little bit better because if you play it like Winota, it can be Winota. If you're just, I'm going to jam the Kinnan as early as I can. I'm going to try to flip it as early as I can. Like, I think a lot of the strength of the deck is it is a powerful politic deck that almost benefits from how kind of awkward its win cons can be. Even when you've won the game with Kinnan, you essentially won the game with Kinnan. Can often be like 2 or 3 turns away from actually winning, because you have to get these pieces that are kind of hard to tutor for, and you're just building this, you know, critical mass of advantage that makes it really, really hard for your opponents to win, but doesn't necessarily threaten to win at any given moment.
Yeah, and again, it has access to blue, so that's what's going to really help the deck out to just navigate these games to like aid in its political ability. Like if this deck was, let's say, red-green, and it like, let's say Kinnan does exactly what Kinnan does, it would not have that ability because it would be looked at as the bad guy deck, you know, because it would be like super fast and it plays Dockside Extortionist.
Yeah.
blah
That's
blah blah
been
blah blah blah.
so huge for me because we talked about before, I played a lot of Roxai, but lately I've been playing a lot of Kinnan. And the political power of being a blue player who doesn't play Dockside and Underworld Breach and being able to say, like, hey guys, there's a red player, watch out. They're going to do Dockside or Breach things. Like, I've had so many times where I'm just like, player cast at Dockside, and that gets me more political power than almost anything I can say. Of just like, okay, this guy has a Dockside. That's scary. How do we help out, the control player of the bunch, which is usually the Kinnan or, something similar. And that's a really powerful aspect of a deck that isn't in the 99. Like it's almost like just this outside of the game effect that you get when you aren't a deck that's like just trying to jam wins very quickly and your commander doesn't seem threatening. Genuinely, I think Kinnan costing 2 makes him seem less scary, even though he should cost like 4 or 5 mana. He's such a broken card, but he only costs 2 mana. No one wants to force the will of Kinnan. They maybe should in some scenarios, because a lot of what he does that's like the high upside play is the activations, which are very hard to interact with unless you run like sort of narrow cards like Containment Priest.
Yeah. So instead of like listening to me like drone on about Kinnan and how great it is, you can actually watch our interview with Wounded, who is a Savage Kinnan player, and they go into really great in-depth and a very eloquent way they speak about it. So eloquent, sorry. That interview is a little bit easier to digest, and we're just kind of, not going in super deep dives on these decks and just more like quick synopsis, like rapid brain fire. So if we missed some intricate detail about your favorite deck on here, don't, let us know in the comments, because honestly, it's just, like we don't have the time to go over all 10 decks in that way. It's not equitable for the podcast.
Yeah. I mainly want to touch on if there's something that really sticks out, like we've talked about, like it's notable that a deck like Kinnan that seemed like it was about to get a lot worse got better. I feel like, and touching on that, I think it was almost unrelated, other than like they got the One Ring and that's broken, because they just started building differently. Like Chimera wasn't as much of a staple in the last update, and it is a lot more. I think just the less flippy the deck is, the better it seems like it's doing. And it recently got a side grade in Flesh Duplicate that I was playing with the card last night, and I was immediately like, this is so much better than Fimage, because it's so easy to lose a Fimage in a like whatever your Fimage thing is on, in like a Bowmaster world, or just anything that can target can just get rid of your whatever copied Kraum or whatever it is. So I really like that card. I think we're gonna see potentially that and Fimage being ran together, because just the 2 mana clone is really strong. I think we might see that in decks that are choosing to run one of those effects going into the next update. But yeah, I kind of expect Kinnan to just stay around this level. I don't know that it's going to overtake our number 1. I do think if you dive into the stats, that you could argue that in the larger events right now, around like 100-ish plus, that Kinnan seems to be doing the best. In events around the 64 to 100 mark, that our number 1 is definitely number 1. And that is with another big gap. I mean, if we were doing a tier list, this is the S tier deck. And with 27 top 16s, 122 entries, 22.13% conversion rate, that is Kraum, Ludovic's Opus with Tymna the Weaver, also known as Blue Farm, TNK, Sands, Green, Breach, the good stuff deck. It's still here. It hasn't changed a lot, other than now you can run some of the Lord of the Rings cards in it. You can Bowmaster is pretty good with Tymna, as we expected. It's pretty good against Tymna. It's pretty good against a lot of the good cards that draw cards. You can run Lotho in here as a way to generate mana advantage in a way that some of the decks, like we mentioned with like Najeela, it's maybe a little bit tougher on your mana base, but in Blue Farm and Tivit, you're kind of just developing those colors early on anyways, because it's pretty frequent that you want to cast an early Tymna. So fetching to get white and black isn't that rough on your mana base or your early decision making. It's still here. I think we're moving a little bit away from the Bosch and roll, run a whole bunch of stacksy-ish creatures. We're not quite on like jamming Containment Priest in the deck. We have seen people run Boromir to some result, either alongside with or in favor of Lavinia. Kind of the same effect for the most part. And some decks are choosing the one to run the One Ring. Other than that, it definitely has the same game plan. It's winning the same ways, and it is drawing cards and winning tournaments.
So another innovation by Comedian is running like Talion. He was discussing about playing like Talion and the One Ring and being a noseless version of the deck, but ultimately played ad nauseum.
It's just too good.
But ran Talion. Yeah, I think it ran ad nauseum over the One Ring. At least that's the way the deck was reported. But still ran Talion. So, again, just another payoff. Talion's a weird card. I can't. But that doesn't feel like a card that's printed in Standard. Like it
very
feels
strange.
like a commander card printed in a Standard.
Like that
set.
one definitely seems like it would have been like the guy in the precon, and then they would have put like one of the random fairy ones that gives you a fairy or whatever into Standard.
Yeah, I don't know. That again. Here we go. Blue card gets whenever your opponent breathes. You get fully rewarded. Like it's just
we're kind of saying like it almost swapping. It's like the new actually playable Notion Thief in a Bowmaster world. Like it's like the only thing. I love Notion Thief so much going into last quarter, and man, is that card horrendous when the ETB of the Bowmaster just kills it. It took one experience of that happening for me to just know that the card was no longer playable. But Talion, I think, is like a 3/3 or a 3/4, and I don't think that's going to be nearly as much of a problem for that draw engine.
It's a good attacker in the air too. Like it can pressure ad nauseum lives again. Like we alluded to earlier with the Shieldred and the Talion in something like Tivit. Again, it helps close the gap and pressure life totals. So while you're not necessarily pressuring the entire table at once, you might be pressuring the ad nauseum player, which you limit their ability to execute their game plan, and you might put them in a more linear one-dimension pathway. So that's something to think about. But there was this notion that Blue Farm was like, couldn't win. Like, and this was fairly recent. This was in like the last like 2 months. Like its track record's bad. I keep telling everybody, and I don't even like. I have Blue Farm build. I play Blue Farm occasionally. It's not even my favorite deck. It's not even like I like Rogside more, but I'm also very realistic when it comes to this. Blue Farm until like Kinnan's on a huge upswing, but until Kinnan has as many wins as Blue Farm or more, and keeps putting up people in the top 16, I don't know what else to say. Like Blue Farm just keeps doing the thing. Like also too, like it's not like Blue Farm has like like a sub 20% conversion rate. It's like pretty high for 122 players. So you compare it to like Tivit that had 110 players in this last quarter at 16.3, 36%. That's still a pretty good conversion rate versus the number of players that played it. Like,
yeah, I think it actually swung up a little bit because that was like a complaint of the deck in previous quarters that it was like hovering closer to that like 19%, like a sub 20% conversion rate because it was so popular and not pulling its weight in terms of like carrying that popularity still. But now it and Kinnan are the only like pretty popular, like really popular decks that have that above conversion rate. And like Tivit, which you talked about, had like 23% or something last time, despite being super popular. Big drop of like 7% conversion rate just down the drain. Similar-ish with Najeela.
What if I told you that Blue Farm is the best performing deck in September?
That's believable.
13 top 16s at 27.8% conversion rate.
That's pretty ballin'.
And Kennan's right behind it. Just for full troll effect, it's at 26.32% conversion rate at like 10 top 16s. Like, obviously, you get 1 month of sample size of decks versus an entire 3 months. But there is some new familiar faces on for September. September had some new sauce in there. Yeah, so I don't know what the thing about like the blue
There's
farm
something
face.
about it that we're just like, I mean, because this was like a huge meme in the community like a year and a half, 2 years ago of like, yeah, Blue Farm should probably be the best deck, but it can't win. Can't win a tournament. Now it's like it still wins tournaments, and people are just like, Blue Farm's not that good. Like, what is the metric for that good? Like, if you want to say that you don't necessarily think that the stats that we focus in on and how we interpret them is like the ideal way to look at cEDH stats, I won't disagree with you, but you should have some sort of metric, I think, included in what you're doing. And it's hard to have a metric that doesn't have Blue Farm at the very least as a top 3 deck in the format, probably top 2. And I don't see how you can have that and then say like, nah, the deck's not that good. If you think it's boring, you don't like it, you don't like high color piles, that's one thing. The point of this series should be to give you a good idea of what a cEDH tournament like breaks down looking like. So if you go into an event, you should know, hey, Blue Farm is probably going to be a good option for my opponents to be running that I should be very wary of because it has, despite being the biggest entries yet again, it has a high conversion rate. It's a very powerful deck. It's very popular and good. You should know, hey, I got to watch out for Blue Farm. Hey, I got to watch out for Kinnan. Hey, maybe I don't have to watch out for Tivit as much now. And just not necessarily say like, oh, Blue Farm's number 1 again. Everybody go sleeve up Blue Farm. But you should go into an event knowing you're going to see the deck. And especially if you want to win a tournament, you're going to have to beat the deck probably in like 4 or 5 of your, say, 7 or whatever games, depending on the size of your event. You're probably going to face it in like at least a third, maybe even a half of your pods that you play in.
It is interesting because other countries do have slightly different meta games and popularity of commanders over there, and those tend to reflect in their tournament results. Like, we I joke about Corval a lot, but Corval shows up quite a bit in Brazil. Like, it's almost always in top 16 in Brazil, and they have pretty big tournaments. So it's one of those things where I just think that like I'm wondering, is the American meta starting to, and I'm going to say North America. So the North American meta is starting to be like, here are the top, whatever, 10-ish decks and I know there's tons of people who play different things because that's what they own. That's what they show up with. That's what they like. Ultimately, we are playing Commander at the end. So, but like the tournament grinders who are like, I'm trying to play the best thing that gives me an opportunity to win the game. You're starting to see that kind of compile towards the upper echelons of the decks because, as you said, we had a big jump from like 7 to 12 to like, and now we moved up to like in the 20s in terms of representation of conversion. And Matt, can you allude to actually why we go by the conversion rates?
So yeah, we've kind of just like agreed sort of as a community, like the real bar of performance in like a large event like this is top 16. I would say most people would agree. If you show up to an event, that is your kind of first goal, other than maybe like this is your very first event, maybe win a game is maybe your goal. But like in terms of like you had a successful tournament run, it's top 16. That's the goal. That's really like making the cut, And then we could look at, and maybe we will, maybe over the year, it might be a little bit better because we have such a small amount of numbers. Looking at like top 4 and wins is usually like, there's like 10 decks or whatever that get tied with like 2 wins or something. So I think looking at actual wins, just performance dependent, it feels like that's maybe where the most variance we see is. And then looking at like top 4s, maybe a little bit more, but I think top 16s we can mostly agree broadly are the main threshold you want to be able to meet for a deck, because like that is success. So some players, podcasts, whatever, might look at something like the win rate of a deck in an event. That can really skew the numbers in favor of decks that almost top 16 and don't quite, and then punish decks that top 16 a lot and then lose at top 16. You definitely, I think, looking at a deck that top 16s and then loses in top 16s and holding that against them is just a terrible way to look at it, when we can agree like, especially as events get larger, top 16 is going to be like, you make money at that point. Like, this is the point where it's like you've done something, and maybe eventually we'll look at top 32s if we get to like really big events. And we might have to adjust how we look at things. But for now, I definitely don't want to look at win rate. Especially like we talked about this a little bit before on air. Like the way you value wins, draws, and losses doesn't really equate that well from like a standard event where you can look at the win rate of a deck like red black evoke, otherwise known as scam, and really get to just see like the deck had a 56% win rate. That tells a lot of the story. You can look at top 16 after that and kind of see how it might match up against certain things and struggle in some places. But that tells a lot of the story. Here, when we talked about Wounded, this came up a lot of like, you'll win like 3 games or 2 games, and then you'll just intentional draw like all the way up to top 16. And it just like, I feel like looking at win rate is a very skewed view into it, especially if you don't factor in a lot of these things that can punish or reward decks for subpar performances, or actually, you know, getting punished for a really good performance.
Yeah, and I think it keeps it clean, because if the metric of a tournament is top 16, because that's how the placements go for these 64 plus events, right? Like, we can't keep moving the goalpost just to have like these different like qualifiers for these decks, and like
it can, when you change the metric that you want to look at for how a deck performs, it opens you up to just leaning into your biases of saying like, well, this time because I really like Ob Nixilis, we're gonna make it down to the top 16 decks or whatever. Like, cool that Ob Nixilis performed well, or if we change it to win, especially if you change it to wins or top 4s, you're looking at like a whole different list with a whole different breakdown for the most part. Blue Farm still ends up on top, but it can really change things. And I don't want to say that top 16s don't count and top 4s are all that matters, because I don't really think that's the case. And it's also like a crazy unrealistic way to view the game. If you only think of top 4ing as, I had a success here, I think you're gonna like be kind of miserable. And also, I just don't think that's realistic. It's hard to top 16. There's value there, and it means you're 1 game away from finals. Like, I think that is absolutely a bar that is worth having set for, at least until we have some better way to analyze this nonsense format that we all choose to play. So yeah, keep in mind, there's tons of factors that go into this. Let us know down below, what do you think is going to be the big winner in the next quarterly update? If you're going to be in an event, let me know what you're going to be playing. If you can come to Top Deck and you see either of us, absolutely come yell at us, say hi. Thank you to Eminence for sponsoring and getting us there. Big shout out to you guys. And for liking this channel and believing in it, and making this awesome software that lets us to get all this data to make videos like this. I think next time we're going to be diving into some of the recent shakeups in cEDH events. We're going to be touching on Eminence's circuit that they're going to be going, which is crazy. I wanted to talk about it in this episode because I'm super hyped for it, but we absolutely don't have time. We're already way over time. You probably hear children yelling in the background. I can't help it. And yeah, so next time, look at that. We're also going to be talking about, maybe not the next episode, but sometime soon, one of Eric's favorite topics, which is the non-North America metas, diving into like what's going on in Japan, what's going on in Brazil, because it's wild and crazy over there. And it's relevant, and like, just because it's not happening on Eminence doesn't mean it's not a real event. You know, they're having huge events over there. There's interesting stuff happening. And if you love spicy deck lists, you absolutely don't want to miss that episode, because they are cracked out over there. It's insane. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, let us know down below. Let us know what you want us to talk about next. Let us know what we got wrong, even though we just used stats. I don't know how we could have got this wrong, but let us know how you interpreted the stats. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, go play cEDH.
Peace.
See ya.